Good afternoon. I'm Prabhat Jela, Provost at Rensselaer, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 15th Annual President's Commencement Colloquy. The Commencement Colloquy was established by President Jackson in 2003 to provide a forum for the Rensselaer community to gather on the eve of commencement for a dialogue with the honorands. Please join me in welcoming the host for today's colloquy, the 18th President of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, Dr. Shirley Jackson.
Well, good afternoon. I didn't hear you. Good afternoon. And welcome everyone to the magnificent Curtis R. Priam Experimental Media and Performing Arts Center for the grand tradition we refer to as the President's Commencement Colloquy. Now, I welcome especially those members of the class of 2017 who are with us and their families and friends. As we consider the world our students are moving into, very complex challenges predominate, including our need to secure sufficient supplies of food, water, and energy for a global population that is likely to increase by a full billion people in just the next dozen years. The concomitant need to mitigate climate change and to build sustainable infrastructure. The need to intelligently allocate valuable natural resources, and the need to provide for national and global security in an often unstable world. These challenges are clearly linked. And because of their interconnectedness, and because of the interconnectedness of our systems and societies, a triggering event anywhere in the world can create intersecting vulnerabilities with cascading consequences. In fact, we are subject to butterfly effects in which apparently small changes sometimes have large consequences, and domino effects in which one failure causes many more. Now, these effects encompass natural and chaotic systems, such as the weather, human societies, and our natural environment. At Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, to prepare our graduates to deal with instability, volatility, change, and opportunity, we have educated them for intellectual agility, multicultural sophistication, and to have a global view. And we have re-envisioned ourselves as the new Polytechnic, a great crossroads for collaboration across disciplines, sectors, geographies, and generations, using the most advanced tools and technologies that address intricate and interwoven global challenges, building resilience into our systems and societies and staving off crises. Today, we have invited to this crossroads two distinguished leaders of very large enterprises who will receive honorary degrees tomorrow. Both have successfully diffused crises of great magnitude and complexity, but both are similarly opportunistic and optimistic in their sense that solutions to great problems can be found, and both are courageous, and you'll find outspoken about our need to work together towards such solutions. Today, we are talking and will consider criticality, incisiveness, creativity. In other words, the ways that great decision-making in moments of truth can change the world. So please allow me to introduce our guests. Our first honorand is President and Chief Executive Officer of TIAA, a Fortune 100 financial company, initially founded by Andrew Carnegie to provide teachers with a dignified retirement. This unique nonprofit financial services company is a leading provider of retirement services in the academic, research, medical, and cultural fields. Under our guests' leadership, TIAA not only survived the recent global financial crisis, but thrived, never missing a retirement payment and emerging with more capital than before the crisis. Today, TIAA has become one of the largest asset managers in the world and has dealt very creatively with the challenges of low interest rates and its customers' need for longer dated investments. Our guest also is the former vice chairman of the Board of Governors of the United States Federal Reserve System, our nation's central bank, which among other functions develops and promulgates monetary policy, promotes the stability of our financial system, and supervises and regulates financial institutions. As the only governor in Washington, D.C., during the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, he was the architect of the decisive Federal Reserve response, calming fears and staving off a financial panic in New York City and Washington, D.C., around the nation and around the globe. In the wake of the global financial crisis of 2008, President Barack Obama appointed him to the Council on Jobs and Competitiveness, as well as its predecessor, the Economic Recovery Advisory Board. Prior to joining TIAA in April of 2008, he was head of financial services for the reinsurer Swiss Re. Earlier in his career, he was a partner at the consultancy McKinsey & Company and an attorney at the New York City office of the law firm Davis, Polk & Wardwell. His board service includes Alphabet, General Mills, and the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. He is chairman of the conference board and recently has been appointed a regent of the Smithsonian Institution. He holds a BA, a JD, and a Ph.D. in economics, all from Harvard University. It is a great honor to welcome the Honorable Roger W. Ferguson, Jr. Our second honorarian and commencement speaker is the Cecil and Ida Green Professor of Physics and Engineering Systems Emeritus and Special Advisor to the President of MIT. He also is co-chairman of the Board of Directors and the CEO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. A member of the MIT faculty since 1973, our honorarian was the 13th United States Secretary of Energy until January 20th of this year. I had the great honor and privilege of serving on the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board during his tenure. His balanced approach to energy policy has helped to lead the United States to greatly improved energy security, with energy-related greenhouse emissions at their lowest levels since 1991. His accomplishments include negotiating in 2015, alongside the United States Secretary of State, the historic Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action between Iran and the major powers of the world, an agreement blocking off all pathways to a nuclear weapon for Iran. During his tenure, the 2015 United Nations Climate Conference in Paris produced an historic international accord on greenhouse gas emissions. His leadership was key to the announcement of a Mission Innovation Initiative at the conference, a joint effort by more than 20 nations to double clean energy research and development by 2020. From 1997 to 2001, he was Undersecretary in the Department of Energy And from 1995 to 1997, he was Associate Director for Science in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. From 2009 to 2013, he was a member of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, where we also overlapped, and a member of the Defense Threat Reduction Advisory Committee. At MIT, our honorarian performed distinguished research in theoretical nuclear physics, led the Bates Linear Accelerator Center, was head of the Department of Physics, director of the MIT Laboratory for Energy and the Environment, and founding director of the MIT Energy Initiative. He received a bachelor's degree in physics from Boston College and a doctorate in theoretical physics from Stanford University. He is a fellow of the American Physical Society, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Ernest J. Moniz. Welcome again, and welcome to you.
Thank you, Shirley.
Thank you.
The title of our colloquy today, Criticality, Incisiveness, Creativity, arises from your biographies, Drs. Moniz and Ferguson, the common experience you've had of making excellent decisions at moments of criticality or great importance. Now, since criticality has another meaning, it is the point at which a nuclear chain reaction becomes self-sustaining. I have to pose my first question to the theoretical nuclear physicists in our midst. So, Secretary Moniz, thank you for joining us. Now, you received a great deal of praise for your skills, both obviously as a scientist and as a diplomat, during the highly technical negotiations that led to the historic agreement between Iran and the major powers of the world designed to block the path of Iran towards a nuclear weapon. Could you please tell us how that agreement has made the world safer and your thoughts on addressing advancing nuclear and the advancing nuclear and missile programs in North Korea?
That's a small question to start.
Oh, yeah. They know
well,
how I am.
First of all, in making the world safer, I think it's probably then a good reference point to go back to where we were and where we presumably would be. Where we were is that Iran, first of all, Iran, many of you know, I'm sure, did not exactly have the trust of the world's nations because of their previous nuclear activities that were discovered in terms of being work that could lead to a weapon. And when we came to this negotiation, Iran had roughly 20,000 centrifuges they were close to operating a new reactor to make more than one to two weapons worth of plutonium per year, et cetera. The bottom line is they were within maybe a couple of months of being able to build a nuclear weapon or to assemble the nuclear weapons material if they chose to. Without a successful negotiation, the presumption is that all of that work would have continued without international verification, and frankly, the likelihood of a military activity was very, very high. So the president decided back in 2009, and no one objected at that time, we'll come back to objections at this time, but at that time, to the idea that I would say in a way very analogous to Ronald Reagan negotiating arms control with the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, when we had a lot of problems with the Soviet Union, the decision was to negotiate on the existential issue of nuclear weapons. The same decision was made here, that we have a lot of problems with Iran, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, human rights, missiles, but the decision was, let's address the existential threat of nuclear weapons while we, of course, deal with the other things separately. So what was accomplished did indeed, as you said, Shirley, block pathways to nuclear weapons in the sense that that 2-month breakout period was extended to, frankly, more than a year for at least a decade, severe restrictions on the nuclear activity for 15 years. But what I want to emphasize is what I consider to be the more important part of the agreement, and this will lead to North Korea. The more important part of the agreement, frankly, was completely unique, novel, transparency, and verification measures. Because given the history, there is no way the world would accept an agreement unless there were the kinds of verification measures, some of which go on, quotes, forever, in terms of their nuclear program. So that was done, and I'll be honest, in my view, it would be great if these special measures became part of the norm for the world. Now, going to North Korea, I think there are some lessons to learn from this. One for sure is there can be no agreement with North Korea, in my view, that does not have at least as stringent verification measures as those that were negotiated with Iran. So that's a useful case to already have, quotes, in our pockets, if that dialogue with North Korea ever actually occurs. On the other hand, I think that there is also a counter to the approach with Iran. I remind you, the major difference, North Korea already has nuclear explosives, Iran does not. In the Iran deal, as I said, I feel the president absolutely made the right call in narrowing the field of the negotiation to the nuclear weapon existential threat. I believe, frankly, we are following an incorrect strategy with North Korea by restricting a possible negotiation to nuclear weapons. The issue, it seems to me, is addressing the real security needs of North Korea, South Korea, China, and Japan simultaneously, and that goes well beyond nuclear weapons. I'll just end by reminding people that North Korea had a pretty effective military deterrent before they had nuclear weapons. It's called thousands of artillery tubes focused on Seoul. So I think that this is a case where we need to widen the discussion and always remember that a verification is not going to be part of this in an Iran or Iran plus way. There can be no negotiated solution in my view.
Interesting. We'll come back to that. Dr. Ferguson, we're really delighted that you could join us. Now, you're much admired for addressing another kind of threat, a possible financial panic following the 9/11 terrorist attacks, with speed, confidence, and great sensitivity. Now, I'm not sure you all realize that before Federal Reserve, because Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan was in fact grounded in Switzerland on 9/11, it was up to you and your team to devise the immediate response. So please tell us about the moment that you understood that the financial system was under attack and how you prioritized the response of the Fed.
Great, Shirley, thank you very much for asking the question. And importantly, thank you for mentioning the team, because by definition, nothing that large is done by one person, though it fell to me, as you point out, to lead the team on that day. So the story of that day, and when I realized that the financial system was under attack, was when I saw the second plane going to the second tower. I had been alerted by my wife, who was at the SEC at that moment and was in charge of watching markets, that something was going on. There was smoke coming out of the first tower, and I turned on the TV to see the plane go into second tower. And immediately my mind went to two or three things. One was obviously the potential, at that stage, potential for loss of life. It seemed quite obvious. We didn't know how much it would be. But seeing the towers on fire, clearly there was going to be some loss of life. But also, having spent quite a while studying the boring but critically important issues of infrastructure, financial services infrastructure, how massive amounts of money get moved around every day, how the checks that you and I write get cleared every day. I happen to also know that literally a few hundred yards from the World Trade Center is a couple of major financial institutions. One, obviously, New York Stock Exchange, which is the embodiment of confidence, if you will, in Western capitalism. And secondly, something not so visible but incredibly important, which is a couple of major banks that are pivotal to the way that money transfers, not just within the US, but around the world. And so, while thinking about the obvious loss of life in New York, what came to my mind, because of my technical background, was the stock exchange is clearly going to be disoriented both physically and psychologically. And secondly, one or two of large banks are nearby, and at the very least, not knowing the extent of the damage, there would be personnel dislocations and possibly, deeper technical locations. One of the reasons that came to my mind was that I had been responsible for the international preparations around a crisis that did not happen, which was Y2K, just a year or two earlier. And that had us thinking about the way financial infrastructure works, how it's all intertwined, what the major pockets of network centrality might be, or criticality in your words. And so immediately it was clear to me that there would be perturbations, back to your thought about the butterfly's wings creating perturbations, that there'd be perturbations across the system. The final thing that drove me, obviously, was we in Washington had an open line to the New York Fed. The call started every Monday around 9:30 or so. And that call clearly also indicated from those on the ground that chaos was emerging from the World Trade Center. And then the final thing, obviously, was not obviously, but as I was listening to the call with the New York Fed, I looked out the window the way the Fed is located in Washington. One can see out across Potomac in the general direction of the Pentagon, and I saw smoke coming from that direction. So it became clear that this was a financial crisis and potentially a government crisis in Washington, D.C. At that moment, it was time to make a small number of what proved to be critical decisions. First and foremost, a relatively small decision that proved actually to be pivotal was the question of, do we stay or do we evacuate? By the time that came up, the president had given an order to evacuate Washington, D.C. I chose not to do that. For a very practical reason, frankly, which is that if we were in motion, and you must recall, 15 years ago was a time before everyone had widely used iPhones and cell towers and things of that sort. So I was afraid we'd be out of touch with New York and other places. And if the team were to be dispersed back to the team, the experts wouldn't be at their desks where they could get things done. The second big decision was, well, what does the Fed as a system do? And I decided that we would stay open as a system. The Fed, as you may or may not know, has 12 reserve banks around the country, one in New York, Boston, other places. Some of the reserve bank presidents wanted to close, and I decided that while we had let non-critical people leave, those who were critical to the operating and financial system should stay. And the third major decision was to say something publicly, because so much of this was around confidence. Right. So we issued a very, very small statement. Someone proposed a longer statement, and I decided a short, pithy statement in a moment of distraction would be most important, and that statement was effectively the Federal Reserve is open and operating, and it became known as the open and operating statement. And the second sentence, a bit more technical, but effectively said the Fed is ready to lend money to keep the federal financial system afloat. So those are the three, big decisions. One, stay in place. Two, keep the system open. Three, make a public statement that effectively said the Federal Reserve, with all of its power, not totally visible to everybody, will stand behind the financial system. And many things cascaded from those three major decisions, fortunately most of them positive. But that was really, the moment when we knew things were in trouble, and that's how we decided, the various steps to take.
Well, there's something that is referred to as threat rigidity when you're in a moment of crisis, and I'm sure there were tense moments when you were, in those negotiations, and I'm sure you had, Ernie, lots of help from people who wanted you to go down a certain path or follow certain rules, and then, as you've already articulated, there were people who wanted certain things, you to do certain things a certain way. So how strong are those pressures when you're in a moment like that, and how do you deal with them? How do you overcome them?
First, I'm going to make one little comment following on Roger's point about not abandoning the Fed. I would just note, and I think, Shirley, you know this, that DOE, because of our nature of our business, we have a satellite set of offices and communications conveniently positioned just outside the damage radius of a nuclear weapon over the White House. So we could have offered you, we could rent you some space right out there. In terms of the pressures, it's actually quite interesting in the Iran negotiation in particular. I have to say, what was key here to allow us the flexibility to deal with those pressures is that the president took the position. Well, first of all, he took one position. You get over to Switzerland in 3 days and negotiate. But then he made it very clear that there were two overarching requirements on which we would not budge. One was that this breakout time to a nuclear weapons material would be at least a year on a decadal time frame. And secondly, that there had to be very, very strong verification measures. What they would be, that's where, frankly, our scientific backgrounds, me and my negotiating partner, was critical. But he said beyond that, you got to make this complicated thing fit together. Couldn't have been more critical because, frankly, there was always, I'll just give one example. The Iranians, part of their subterranean program had been to build a subterranean enrichment facility in a place called Fordo. And this Fordo facility could not accommodate enough centrifuges to be of any relevance to a civilian nuclear power program, only enough to be relevant to a nuclear weapons program. So therefore, there was an assumption going in that an agreement would have to have a completely cleaned out, closed Fordo. Well, it turned out this was a major political issue for the Iranians. And the president held to his guidance and allowed me to make a case that rather than cleaned out, it would be cleaned out of uranium. The IAEA, the international inspectors, would have 24/7 access, but that they would be allowed to keep some centrifuges modified, operating to do things like make medical isotopes. So for them, this was a politically very important statement. It was all hell broke loose in Washington and with Congress, but we held that line, and those were the kinds of trade-offs that were essential to making this work. And frankly, and it's in the agreement, Iran's activity of relevance to nuclear power did get subtracted by these non-nuclear activities we allowed to stay. So that was the art of the deal. And again, the president's direction, and in the end, understanding what the real objectives were, not some, in some sense, fake requirement, would hold.
Because you have to do that against the backdrop of knowing there would be a gale wind that comes and was probably already blowing as you were in the middle of making those kinds of decisions.
Yeah, we certainly many, many stages, particularly, I'll be honest, I had to keep thinking many, many times, how will I sell this to Congress? This was not one of the easier ones, but we got through it because it became completely immaterial to our core objectives.
Now, you were thanking me for mentioning the team, but when you're in the middle of the crisis you faced, the team can be giving you a whole lot of disparate advice, including against what your judgment is telling you. So how'd you deal with that?
Well, let me pick up a word that you heard here, which was keep in mind the core objective. Because there's a lot of noise in the moment of a crisis, and I'll give some examples of teams giving me information or advice that was not good. But I think the main point is, what's the mission, what's the core objective? And so I decided on 9/11, the obvious objective was a vague phrase, but something that many of us had been studying, which is something called financial stability. I had to reassure and ensure that there would be financial stability in the US and globally. And that did mean rejecting, some advice. So one was overcoming the resistance of some folks who wanted to shut the system and, act like any other government agency and sort of leave. There was someone, when I said that we were going to use all the reserves, all the resources of the financial reserve system to ensure financial stability, one of our technocrats reminded me that would mean that the balance sheet of the Fed, for a variety of technical reasons, it would become the largest it had ever been in history. And in fact, until recently, the Federal Reserve balance sheet on September 12th and 13th was the largest. So I had to remind him that that was the point of the balance sheet, that it had to be expansive at these moments, back to the point that is the core objective. The other side, though, is individuals who, in a moment of crisis, tend to lose sight of the objective, and instead of underreacting, overreacting. So there was somebody else who said, as I was hosting a call of some federal and state bank supervisors and regulators, we should advise the president to declare a bank holiday and close all the banks. That's the opposite of financial stability. Mm-hmm. Had we closed, anyone who studied U.S. financial history would know that in the one time when we closed the banks, created a false bank holiday, it is very hard to reopen them. And so you're creating financial instability. And then the final example I would give is around thinking through, again, back to the core objective, what are the building blocks that create core objective? Ironically, one of the most important was that we not allow any ATMs to run out of money. Because during the course of a crisis, what do people naturally do? They run to the bank, they withdraw some cash because they need to have cash. If you think about, you hear a hurricane is coming, you run and get cash. So, though it's relatively small, one of the most important things we did was to work with the governors in New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut to make sure there is ample currency in all the systems, all the ATMs. And I'm really proud of something relatively small, which is, as far as I know, only one ATM in Manhattan that was functioning ran out of currency, which was a heroic activity around the team and a great partnership. But it really goes back to keep in mind the objective, keep in mind the building blocks, and then I'd say, that's the right phrase, nuance your reactions so that you don't underreact out of rigidity, but nor do you overreact out of a sense that it's a crisis and, by overreacting, you overcome the crisis. Sometimes by overreacting, you're a physicist, you are as well, I am not, but you throw more energy into the system. I'm sorry?
Not yet.
Not yet.
By the end of
I will be by the end of this weekend. No, but one of the lessons I vaguely recall from physics, basically, is you throw more energy into the system, things can speed up and get out of hand. I'm sure there's a more technical way of saying that. And so, being nuanced so that you don't throw more energy into a chaotic system helps to slow things down.
Madam President, you have an unruly group here. Can I ask a question?
Of course you can.
Related to financial stability and things like Iran and other of these things, I would really be interested in your view. Maybe it's more of a treasury issue, but obviously, the United States we have a lot of sanctions on a lot of places. And more, we are using the fact that we have the reserve currency, that we have the banking system of the world kind of functions through American banks. To what level, at what point do you become, maybe we've already passed it, concerned about overusing this tool and running into serious problems with our role in the global financial system?
So I think that's one of the, a very, very important and nuanced question. And I think the way you handle it is by being, again, quite clear around what the guardrails are, but more importantly, about being clear about the explanation, right? Mm-hmm. So the risk that we have by using financial sanctions as a tool of national policy is that there will become a concern in the world that, the central bank, which is responsible for monetary policy, the currency, stability of the currency, is secretly leaning in one direction or the other. Mm-hmm. I think the way you handle it is to be quite explicit about the rules of engagement, why it is that certain countries are on certain lists and others are not, so that you can give clear guidance about what one has to do, what a country has to do to, if you will, stay a full and complete member of the global financial system versus being something of a pariah. Without clarity of rule, then you get into a place where it's heavily, potentially personality-driven. One doesn't know when you're on the right side or the wrong side, and then I think suspicion creeps in. So as long as the rules are clear about who's allowed in the system, but more importantly, what it takes to be kicked out of the system, to be put on a FATF list, a money laundering kind of list, then I think you can manage the potential conflict that you're talking about.
Yeah, although there's still the geopolitical question of other countries saying enough's enough and we're going to do.
Absolutely, and you see that occurring quite a bit.
Yeah.
Actually, that raises a follow-on question for you vis-a-vis Iran, and then I have a follow-on question for you that comes out of Ernie's question. The follow-on question is this. There was some sense, there had been this sanctions regime economic sanctions against Iran, and a sense that perhaps that was beginning to fray anyway, and that, had not this Iran agreement been brought into play, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that system was likely to fray further and its effectiveness, wouldn't be there. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, that's also, so the answer is yes, I will comment. And secondly, I want to say that this is an important comment also for the future should the deal not work. So the first point is that the sanctions, as you implied quite clearly, were effective only because of the international cooperation. That's right. It was absolutely unprecedented. The negotiating countries were the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, France, Russia, and China. And you think about it, 2015 was the critical period. U.S.-Russia relationships were not exactly running smoothly, nor are they today. But despite that, everybody understood a nuclear weapon in Iran was going to be bad for everybody. And so everybody stuck together. But the sanctions regime required not just those 6 countries, but it was also India and Japan withholding proceeds for the limited oil sales, et cetera, et cetera. And as you say, people were getting a little bit tired of them. So that was an issue. But I think a more important question really is, what would happen if we were to walk away from this hard-won agreement?
That's right.
Actually, Brent Scowcroft, the senior President Bush National Security Advisor, he said it, as he typically does, extremely concisely. We walk away alone. We walk away alone, there are no effective sanctions. Then it's the worst of both worlds. So I think this reality has kind of set in that it makes no sense for us to violate the agreement. We need to assure compliance. And we need to work on all those other issues.
That's right.
That are in play. This administration is doing that. They're doing the same thing that the Obama administration did. We did the same thing. We ramped up security collaboration with the Gulf countries, with Israel, et cetera. And the idea that the sanctions relief, which, by the way, and of course Iran complains that the financial rewards are not up to their expectations, partly because they were out of the banking system for so long, they will make that. But the fact is, look, a rocket for Hezbollah costs $1,000. It is not a money limit. It's only political limits that will come into play. So right now we have some sanctions relief, we have compliance. Makes no sense for us to walk away.
So that's an important one that I think there's been a lot of, misunderstanding. And here's another one for you, Roger. Given the centrality, of the U.S. and our capital markets, our banking system to global markets, and talk a little about this injection of capital into the major banks at the time of the onset of the great meltdown that led to the Great Recession, and why that was necessary.
Right. So, as you clearly have said, banks are central to the functioning of the financial system, because what banks do effectively is take small amounts of money and through effectively bank accounting, lending it out, create larger amounts of money. But they only do that if they are assured of having access to funding. And the whole system effectively depends on banks having the confidence to lend. And so whenever one is at a crisis, either 9/11 or after 2008, for better or for worse, one of the first things that one has to do is what's called reliquify or recapitalize the banks. This is a hard thing to do in a democracy because it looks as though the authorities, at a moment when the country is in crisis and households are under duress, is turning around and supporting the banking system. But the reason this is important to do is through the banking system that we bring credit back into the broader system and create a broader sense of confidence. And so back to your butterfly analogy, in some sense, though they're not butterflies at all, the banks are where, if you want to use the analogy, we sort of kick off the creation of credit, the creation of money, the creation of the ability of people to fund themselves. We have, in a capitalist society, no other tool. And that is really why, even if we didn't have a central bank, you have exactly the same kinds of behaviors in the private sector. I can tell one quick story about this. So the Federal Reserve was created as a result of a huge financial meltdown that occurred in 1907. And the way that was resolved was that J.P. Morgan famously walked across the street from his bank, there was no central bank in the United States, to the New York Stock Exchange and put in a very loud voice, orders to buy 100 shares of a variety of things, recreating the sense of confidence, putting liquidity back in the system. And so, this is a tool that has to be used even if you don't have a central bank. Because all of us depend on creating capital, if you will, liquidity from the banking network. So it's hard for people to understand. It's hard. It looks as though we're supporting the banking system, but it is actually supporting the economy overall through the mechanism of the banking system. Does that make sense?
Secretary Moniz, you got a lot of credit as the Secretary of Energy for taking an all-of-the-above approach to energy security. And that ranged everywhere from nuclear power, which is one of my great interests, to the investments that the Department of Energy made in unconventional oil and gas extraction technologies. But that New York State does not allow, for instance, hydraulic fracturing or fracking. Is there anything that you can say about those who have environmental or health concerns about the way we're accessing our current quote-unquote windfall in natural gas and oil? And what do you say about those who might even worry about nuclear in the aftermath of Fukushima? Or is it all about the economics?
Well, first of all, let me just make one comment on the all of the above strategy. It certainly was a hallmark of our approach, and by our approach, I want to start with President Obama, who, to be perfectly honest, to the annoyance of some of his staff, stayed true to all of the above. What all of the above means, I want to make it very clear, is that it starts with commitment to a low-carbon future.
Exactly.
Within that constraint, then the idea is any fuel, any technology that can be part of the solution, actually solutions, we support. And that's important because the solutions to a low-carbon future will look very different in different countries, and they will look very different in different regions of the United States for a variety of reasons. Public attitudes, available of renewable resources, wind or solar or geothermal, et cetera. So that is the underpinning philosophy of all of the above, which is not universally celebrated, shall we say, but it was something that we actually stuck with very hard. Now, on natural gas and fracking, I will recommend, all of you should make a note now, go look up the transcript of a White House South Lawn discussion on October the 3rd, 2016, not long ago, in which Leonardo DiCaprio was playing your role, and we are President Obama and Catherine Hayhoe, a climate scientist from Texas. And most of the discussion was about climate science, what the risks are, et cetera. And we can get into my view of that. But in the middle of it, the president then made a very interesting kind of intervention. And it was, here's a president, nobody can question his commitment to and knowledge of the climate risks and pursuing solutions. But he had a piece that said, look, we gotta be pragmatic. And he said, if you want me to go and tell a working class dad who drives 50 miles each way to work every day to try to keep food on the table, et cetera, and tell him how bad it's going to be in 50 years, you gotta be kidding. It's not gonna work. That we have got to realize we've got to bring everybody along, we've got to create the political kind of coalitions, otherwise it's going to take us longer to get there than doing that. Among that, he was very explicit on fracking. He said to this audience that was not exactly of mixed views on climate, he said, I know a lot of you aren't going to like this, but the reality is hydraulic fracturing in natural gas has been great for the economy, and it is a principal reason for our lowered CO2 emissions, because the market has driven natural gas, to displace coal. And coal has dropped by 40% in just a relatively short time. And so this substitution by natural gas accounts for something like 60% of our CO2 reductions. And we are now 14% below 2005. So he said, look, it's revived manufacturing in the United States. It's a big driver of manufacturing while reducing CO2 emissions. Sure, when it's been done improperly, it's created some problems. But we got to address this as this is a critical part of the bridge to a low carbon future. What we've got to do is work on the environmental footprint and keep shrinking it. Okay,
so as you say, Cotton, if you start with this frame that has to do with a a low carbon future. But then you talked about the worker who's driving 50 miles each way to work. But if you translate that over to folks who worked in mines, if one is just looking at the idea of creating jobs or recreating jobs that pay at a certain level, is it realistic to talk about or to turn to coal? Or are the market forces such that it just won't work anyway?
Well, first of all, for coal, in the all of the above, of course, what that translated into operationally was our investing $6 billion in looking at the technologies for capturing CO2 and storing it underground as a way to find a place that coal could also have a place in a low carbon world. Now, there's a lot of cost reduction still needed in that arena. It certainly works, but it's funny. It's the same equation for all the technologies. Solar energy was extremely expensive. In fact, only a decade ago, maybe it was 12 years ago, I had a speaker at MIT from India who was a pioneer in getting small-scale solar and batteries into rural contexts, together with microfinance. He made a very interesting statement, which is no longer true. His statement then, just a decade ago, was solar energy is too expensive for the rich, but very affordable for the poor. And the reason was, if you're living in that village and you have no access to light other than lighting a kerosene burner and burning your house down possibly, it doesn't take much solar energy to drive a light. Changes the life.
Right.
It's no longer true because it's no longer too expensive for the rich. It's the costs have come down dramatically. Well, we are still at the very early stages on something like carbon capture. There's no reason to think that we can't drive those costs down if we make the investments in innovation and R&D. And so that's what all of the above is all about.
Maybe that needs to be part of an infrastructure approach.
And maybe I'll just add on the job part that there's often the very facile response, which does have the advantage of being true, that the number of jobs lost in coal mining are in the few tens of thousands, whereas, let's say, solar jobs in the last 5 years, 6 years, we've added 200,000 solar jobs. But that's facile because, first of all, the jobs aren't in the same geography. You lost jobs in Appalachia and you gained them in California and Massachusetts and New York, number one. And number two, frankly, most of those jobs do not have the same wages as those jobs that were lost.
Correct.
And so that's why we need to look at the social questions about looking regionally, locally, what are the structures that we can support there economically to make sure those families and communities understand they do have a future in a very low carbon economy.
There have been, Roger, companies and industries that have actually pushed governments toward changed carbon policies. Now, prominent among them was Swiss Re, which is, as you know, because you were there, a member of the reinsurance industry, which is a rather esoteric branch of financial services that insures for outside risk, including those that arise from extreme weather events. So can you talk a little bit about how climate risk is viewed at Swiss Re?
Sure. So you've described exactly what reinsurance is, which is the insurance for insurance companies. And so reinsurance is the ultimate risk bearer in society before you get to governments. I was at Swiss Re for 1.5 years after I left the Fed, responsible for managing their assets. And one of the things, and I was on the executive committee, one of the risks that we watched very closely was risk associated with climate change. And the reason is it doesn't take much to imagine with just continued rising in sea levels, given not just in the US, but in a large part of the US, the amount of development we've done along the East Coast, think of Florida, think of Long Island, if you think of the UK, think of London actually, literally billions of dollars, maybe even more, of commercial and residential investments could be quite literally underwater. And that obviously is a huge challenge for a company that's in the business of providing the backstop to those who are writing insurance. So Swiss Re has taken a very active role in thinking through how to do risk mitigation in this space, how to drive thinking around alternative carbon footprints, et cetera. And they're very importantly pioneered something called catastrophe bonds, which are basically a way for the financial markets to reinsure catastrophes. So they're moving, if you will, the financial part of this away from their balance sheet out to the market. If I could pick up, though, more broadly on this question of climate change and take it to what my company is doing. And so we are well aware of, I think, a very good point that Ernie made and that the president made, which is as one is thinking about climate change, you have to be both grounded in the here and now, the reality of what's doable, but also thinking about the future. And so at TIAA, which is one of the world's largest investors, we invest about $1 trillion.
We know all about you here.
Right. The money for the faculty and staff here, plus at MIT, plus about 5 million Americans and 15,000 institutions. We're constantly challenged around this question of what do you think about climate change? And the position that we have staked out, that I've staked out, is what I describe as a both-and position. We have a number of our individual clients who are saying, we want no investments having to do at all with, hydrocarbons and, the old world. And for that group, we have created green funds and other socially screened investments. But I also say to everyone, it is impossible for a big investor that has to be responsible for providing retirements today to completely withdraw from a hydrocarbon world, because hydrocarbons are such a large portion of the modern economy. And so one has to really be quite nimble in this, as the president was. Let's be very realistic about what one can do. Over time, we want to lower our carbon footprint. Right now, we have a hydrocarbon-driven world, and how do you manage both of those? And from our standpoint as an investor, we're working really hard to manage, to get good returns consistent with moving towards a greener footprint while recognizing that we also have to stay invested in the existing carbon-generated economy.
Shirley, can I just make a comment?
Sure.
First of all, I do want to be more straightforward in saying that Swiss Re was really out in front in addressing the climate issues, did a terrific job. But secondly, just to give the scale of costs, it might be interesting as an anecdote, in Florida, one utility, Florida Power and Light, last year when Hurricane Matthew came through, the benefits of the resilience they had brought into their system made a big difference in getting the lights back on for their customers. That one utility, we're talking about $4 billion. This is like hardening poles, et cetera. $4 billion in one utility in an awkward position with regard to sea level, et cetera.
Absolutely.
But just to give you an idea of the scale, this is big money.
Another way to look at it is obviously think about the economic and social costs from Superstorm Sandy, which is just another metric, but exactly the same thing, $60 billion.
Yeah, right.
Well, let's shift it just a little bit. By the time most members of our graduating class are 35 years old, the world population will be a circa 8.5 billion or more. And so one of the greatest challenges has to do with growing enough food for that many people on a planet that has a limited number of arable acres. And I think our audience might be surprised to learn from you that TIAA is the world's largest investor in farmland. And I'll tell you that its vineyard ownership makes it the second largest grower of wine grapes in the United States. Now, and these are because these are longer dated, higher yielding investments that work well for retirement products, although they aren't without controversy. Now, when people think of industrial scale agriculture, people think about environmental and health costs, ranging from soil erosion to the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria and how that gets into the food chain. And so TIA has helped to develop these principles of responsible investment in farmland as a guide to institutional investors globally. And so talk to us a little bit about those principles and how they relate to sustainability of agriculture.
So first, you're right. I think it is a surprise to many that the retirement savings of teachers and faculty and staff here and other places is invested in agricultural land and is...
Well, we're interested in the wine grapes.
I know. I've got a little card that shows some, no, not all, of the wines that you can consume that are supporting your retirement. I'm sure we'll have some of that later today. But importantly, as you point out, these are long-dated assets that have the great advantage of being renewable. And so we have to think about this as being the stewards of these assets to provide for your retirement, my retirement, Ernie's retirement, but also for people who are, a generation or two younger than we are. So we have, in fact, driven these principles of responsible investing. The first one of those really has to do with how one manages your current investments in a way that's quite sustainable. And so in the orchards that we have that grow not just grapes, but also almonds and other things, we think about our water usage. And during the recent drought, the governor of California was quite positive about the approach that we take, which is to think about, frankly, using what's called euphemistically recycled water. And that has helped drive this. We also have been using higher technology tools to identify exactly the amount of fertilizer and watering that's called for, almost hectare by hectare, to increase the productivity of our land. We are bringing capital to bear in ways that hasn't been true before. And so there are a range of things that one can do to deal with the challenge of a relatively finite amount of arable land against a dramatically increasing global population, but doing it in a way that creates sustainability. Now, the good news is this is one of those areas, it's often thought that being green, being more sustainable is inconsistent with increasing return. In agriculture, it's just the opposite. Being smart around technology, driving over longer periods of time, more sustainability has allowed us to create the value in these agricultural commodities and in the land itself.
Maybe it's worth just noting for some of the audience that that land use is a very major source of carbon emissions.
Absolutely.
Second to energy use.
It
the other thing, if I may make another point, Shirley, as those additional billion people come online, shall we say, and the current 7.5 billion plus the new billion, of course, go up the economic ladder. Something like protein intake per person very reliably follows the economic curve. If we reach the kind of economic performance of the world's 7-8 billion people that we hope for, there is not enough land for the protein intake on our model, that is beef, for example, because that's a very inefficient use of land per gram of protein intake. So there has to be a different model also for diet, et cetera, if we are to have a sustainable future.
Well, people can bioengineer this meat substitute, which is already beginning to happen. So you started something called Mission Innovation to put R&D at the center of the worldwide effort to decarbonize. And there are a number of innovative things that, you've done and things in the Department of Energy. But what I really want to ask you about is this. The current administration's proposed fiscal year 2018 budget zeroes out ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Projects Agency in Energy, designed to do breakthrough energy research. Although Congress, in the fiscal year 2017 appropriations bill, increased funding for ARPA-E. Is eliminating ARPA-E likely, realistic, or wise?
No. Let me start with let me start with a broader response, which goes directly to this. So you mentioned mission innovation, where the commitment of doubling over 5 years of R&D. What I want to emphasize is that in the period from the Paris meeting, late in 2015, to the end of the administration, clearly, many of us did a lot of work with Congress on the innovation agenda. Now, everybody understood this was innovation for low-carbon technologies. But as long as you didn't say climate and called it the innovation agenda, there was terrific bipartisan support. And so I would say that the 2017 action that you referred to, in fact, let me go back a step, anecdote. Let's face it, just as a statement of fact, the administration is still working out a few kinks, shall we say, in terms of intra-administration communication. So on March the 8th, now DOE Secretary Perry put out a tweet quite correctly praising ARPA-E, days before the OMB put out a budget saying we're going to zero it. Congress weighed the two and decided to give a 5+% increase in the budget. Now, don't want to be Pollyannish about this, the path forward, but I would say as long as the non-military, as long as the civilian budget does not take an enormous top line hit, I don't think the energy programs are going to be differentially hit in a major way. And certainly, I would be very surprised if ARPA-E, which is kind of the face of innovation, is cut. So I think, there'll be a budget coming out next week for fiscal year 18. It will not be pretty in this domain, but I fully expect Congress to take a different approach.
At the height of the Cold War and the space race, R&D represented about 11% of the federal budget. It's down to about 3.5%. On the other hand, healthcare costs are about 25%. So, but I'm a believer, and there are many who do believe, that investment in R&D, but including and especially perhaps in the healthcare and biomedical arena is important. So how do you square those? How do we create some balance and so that we can make the crucial investments that need to be made?
So you're looking in my direction, so I assume that's aimed at me. So I think the main thing...
No, I was thinking him, but I'm looking at you. No, I'm just kidding.
I think the main thing is not to create false trade-offs.
Yes.
And also to be grounded in reality, which is, if we are not careful, we'll soon be in a place, in about 15 to 20 years, where almost the entire budget is consumed by entitlement spending, defense spending, and interest on the debt, which is clearly unsustainable. And so I would argue that we need to, in fact, make R&D investments, because the way you grow a larger economy to deal with some of the cost challenges that we have is by dealing with an interesting problem that we've had, which is that productivity growth in the U.S. has been very, very low for a long period of time. The periods when productivity growth have been highest are those when we're taking good basic research and science and converting that into the ability to manufacture more goods and services with fewer workers or with fewer hours worked, or increasing the amount of productivity. And so you need to keep driving basic science, basic research, and then figuring out translation and application in order to make the whole system work. The other thing I think we really have to focus on, and you put your finger on it, there are a number of sectors, healthcare is the largest and most visible, that have not yet had the kind of productivity improvements that we've seen in agriculture and in manufacturing. There's a great economist who just died earlier this week, late last week, named William Baumol, B-A-U-M-O-L. He was famous for creating the concept of Baumol's cost disease, as he called it. And he identified a number of sectors in which the cost kept going up, the percentage of GDP kept going up because they were not getting productivity increases. Sadly, there are many that I deal with. One is healthcare, one is the arts. As he points out, you can't play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony any faster now than you could in 1860. And a third, frankly, here on a campus is education. So we need to turn some of our R&D attention, particularly to creating greater productivity in the healthcare space. And so I see these two things as totally intertwined. Better knowledge, better science leading to better outcomes, but hopefully at a lower price point. And so I think the main thing is not to create false trade-offs, but to suggest that good research, good development is the input to a more rapidly growing economy that allows us to afford some of these areas that are now eating up the budget.
You know, I've read that the productivity gains have also been absent in the haircut business, but I don't know. You can
yes, I can speak to that, eh? Between the two of us, we have a lot of knowledge about how barbers work.
But what I would say is that you both are saving money, you know, each in your own way.
Each in our own way.
Can I make another comment on the R&D though? I just want to say that and a certain irony that would follow if things like the OMB budget were put into place. First of all, and we can elaborate on this, but there's no going back after Paris. We are going to a low carbon economy. There's no doubt about it. There may be some bumps in the road, but we're going there for lots of reasons. It would be, and that means, by every estimate, we are seeing it grow now, but there will be a multi-trillion-dollar global market for this low-carbon economy.
I think that's right.
That's a big prize, if you just put it in those terms. Wouldn't it be ironic if we succeeded in getting every other major economy to significantly increase their investments in clean energy technology innovation, and then we chose not to? Not very smart, right? So
let's dream a little bit here. We've been talking some fairly significant things. You know, Ernie, the young scientists, the engineers, the architects, artists, etc., we're going to graduate tomorrow, are going to help shape the technologies of the future. Are there any particular ones or any particular breakthroughs that you dream about?
well, I think in the if I start out at least in the this clean energy space, maybe one way to say it is that when mission innovation was announced, this doubling of R&D, there was an interesting bifurcation of responses. Some said, well, look, we don't need that. We've got all the technologies we need. We just need to have the will to put them in place. Others, Bill Gates being the foremost statement, a person stating, no, we can't get there without major new breakthrough innovations. So I was asked many times, which is it? And the answer was yes. if you think of it in different time frames. So for example, to meet our Paris commitments, which is 27% in 2025 reduction, we better be able to get there with what we got now, because there isn't going to be a big breakthrough innovation that's going to scale on that kind of a decadal time frame, 8-year time frame. On the other hand, I firmly believe that the industrialized economies, for sure, need to go way beyond Paris targets. We need deep decarbonization by mid-century. I'm talking 80, 90% reductions. We cannot get there without big breakthroughs. Today, in our little science session before coming here, one of them was discussed. It's happening in RPI, it's happening some other places. For example, an example of a holy grail is an affordable, scalable approach that takes CO2, sunlight, and water, and produces a drop-in hydrocarbon replacement liquid fuel. There's no law of physics that says you can't do it. It's currently done at very small scale in the laboratory, way far away from having the kinds of breakthroughs that would make that a scalable thing. That's an example of a dream that could be completely changing. I'll just mention one other in the same context, because I think large-scale carbon management is going to have to be part of deep decarbonization. Another one would be through biology, to greatly increase the ability to fix carbon in the land, basically. Deep-rooted variants, et cetera, et cetera. So lots and lots of possibilities.
So I want to get to the audience here, but let me, on the technology, no, because I got a special question for you.
All righty. You ask your question, and I'll answer the question I want to answer.
I know, we know how it goes.
But I'm happy to listen to and note down your question.
Well, you're on the board of Alphabet, right? Yeah. And they've made great breakthroughs in machine learning, artificial intelligence. So are human financial advisors going to be replaced by smart machines? Now, you might not want to answer that, so you can answer the one you wanted to answer.
I'll answer that, and then I'll answer the one I want to answer as well. So no, the answer is, I think over time what we're going to find, and the secret, I think, of AI, is our ability as human beings to work with and become more productive by using artificial intelligence. So again, as Ernie often answers questions with yes, when others would, so my answers tend to be both and. We're going to see an increase in the ability of machines and algorithms to learn, and then we are going to learn how to work with them so that we become much more productive, as opposed to some of the dystopias that people worry about. To the earlier question that you asked, Ernie, I'd like to throw in, it's not a dream, but I think technology that helps us to do three things would be really important. One is we have an inexorably aging population, not just here in the US, but in...
On this stage.
Speak for yourself. But in Western Europe, in China, and so we're going to have to figure out R&D solutions to making longevity, in some sense, more productive.
Yes.
And frankly, helping to deal more aggressively with the illnesses that are highly correlated with aging, most obviously mental issues, but also I'm on the board of Memorial Sloan Kettering. Cancer is another illness of the aged. And so R&D that thinks about making longer life not just possible, because it exists, but also bearable and more meaningful, I think is important. The second one goes back to the outcome of the election, and a very good point that Ernie made. We actually have created millions of jobs since the end of the crisis, but they're not in the places where people are feeling most displaced by technology. They are in the big cities, they're in little pockets around great places like this, et cetera. So if I had to think about not a long-term dream, but a 10-year answer, is how do we use technology to take jobs to communities where people aren't moving? Because in the old days, the last time we went through this major transition was going from agrarian to industrial. And what happened was people left the farms and moved to where the industrial jobs are. We now discover, at least in America, people are not leaving the places where the jobs used to exist to go where the new jobs are. So we have to figure out how to get them into, the economy.
Probably it's because of the bankers. They can't afford to sell their houses.
Well, actually, I will make a comment to that. I actually think that, and this is something that I will credit President Obama with. I think new approaches to manufacturing,
Absolutely.
So-called advanced manufacturing, things that allow in situ manufacturing, development of new materials that can then be used in different ways. I think those things do offer a great opportunity to kind of take the jobs to where people are. But I do think that there has to be a national conversation about the fact that the jobs won't be the jobs necessarily of old, although I think there's some bridging things that can occur. Let's take a few questions.
I was going to make just one advertisement.
Please do.
One advertisement.
Okay.
Since Roger mentioned cancer, and this is something that you were involved with at DOE with the high performance computing thing. I actually believe that the most interesting part and possibly the most telling part of the so-called cancer moonshot that Vice President Biden led last year is actually going to come out of the DOE because of the combination of high performance computing, huge big data analytics, AI and machine learning on an enormous scale using enormous integrated clinical, environmental, genomic databases to go through that in ways that no human could do.
Welcome to Rensselaer.
Right, yeah.
Let's hear from the audience. I think there are some people, we always give our trustees a chance if they would like to ask a question, if they're not intimidated.
Thank you very much for that, for sharing the experiences of those two seminal events, one the Iran negotiation and Roger, the 2001 issues. What that shows, though, in terms of the theme of this colloquy, most of all, is your creativity, which comes with experience, intelligence, but also with your education. So if you could put yourself now back to where our class of 2017 is. These are people who are very, very bright, well-educated, but they're now, a significant portion of them are going out into the world in their first job. How would you suggest to them that they incorporate the various experiences they've had here to develop and then apply the type of creativity that you've used for things that may never be in their lives, but may, because they will be the leaders of tomorrow?
Yes. Go ahead, Roger.
You start.
The easy questions. Yeah. So, look, I think, as I think about my career and the way things evolved and where I was when I was, graduating many years ago from college, the main lesson I've learned is, the cliches around being a continuous learner, which seems so boring and trite, but yet it is really so true. And I think the good news for anyone graduating from Rensselaer is you've learned a lot of facts, you've learned some theories, but most importantly, I think you've learned how to learn. And one of the things that I figured out in my life is, in every role, what am I learning that then allows me to build on my own human capital, as an economist would say. And so I think young graduates should go out in a really enthusiastic, optimistic mindset that yes, the world will be filled with change. Yes, the jobs that you'll likely have some of them don't even exist today. But the main thing that you've learned how to do is learn how to learn. And that is the thing that will give you the ability to constantly refresh and keep up with the changing environment. And I think that's, in some sense, the most important skill, which is the skill of being a continuous learner. The second thing I presume you know how to do is something, again, is a bit of a cliche, but sitting on top of a Fortune 100 company is so valuable. It's also learning how to work in teams, which I presume gets taught here. And the third thing, obviously, is the ability to communicate and articulate well your ideas. So those three fundamental skills have lasted throughout my life, and then you put them together in ways that allow you to have, creative solutions when crises emerge, I think.
Yeah, I would just, I certainly agree with that, and I would just amplify in a couple of points. And this is part of my speech tomorrow, so I don't know.
The teaser.
But look, Roger said, I'll just repeat it. The clock speed of change in society is much of it technology-driven, is just dizzying at times. And earlier we had these discussions around certain communities. Let's face it, those with less education have a hard time adjusting to these changes. Graduates of a place like Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute are exceptionally well positioned to not only to react to, but to manage that change, not only for society, but in their personal lives and in their careers, et cetera, et cetera. Having said that, I think we can all talk about this. I would say in my 4 decades of career, I've really had like 4 different decadal jobs, and now I'm starting my 5th decadal job, et cetera. What I would emphasize is, particularly with the skill sets that these graduates have, to welcome opportunities that come up that may take you in a different direction. It takes a little courage sometime, a little support, but you don't want to spend your later years looking back at what you might have done. So I think you got to just get out there, and if it looks like the right thing to do, just do it. You got the skill set, certainly, to manage those kinds of changes.
Right.
I agree.
So I think we have one from a faculty member here, and from a student here.
Hi, good afternoon. So my question is for Dr. Moniz. I'm going to introduce myself a little bit, and then I'll get into my question. So I'm Cynthia Collins. I'm an associate professor in chemical and biological engineering at RPI, Rensselaer. My group is focused on looking at microbial communities. And so we're using the strategies that you guys just highlighted for cancer, so genomics and big data analytics, to build our understanding of these communities so that we can do things like build systems that will make fuels and commodity chemicals, or to understand and build new strategies for understanding microbiomes and their effect on human health, and new antimicrobial strategies. And so it's really exciting to be in this amazing new field and using all these new technologies. But something that we're faced with often in this kind of field is this disconnect between, say, scientists and engineers on one side and the general public and maybe politicians on the other side, in terms of how we think about technical issues and science in general. And so I think one of the key accomplishments that you had at the DOE that we haven't talked about today is essentially the expansion and update of your scientific integrity policy, which I think was an astounding thing to implement. And so I was wondering if you could comment on whether or not you think these policies can help protect scientists in the open scientific environment in a climate where scientists might feel challenged by, say, politicians in terms of, what's actually real and what's actually verifiable, to go back to the very beginning of this conversation, and how that we can ensure that, or if policies like this can ensure that the next time that there's a large challenge, that the technical experts, such as those that you relied upon during the Iran negotiations, are going to be the ones that are brought to the table when you have challenges like that. And how maybe other ways that you think that we can maybe bridge this divide between these groups that, from my perspective, seems to be broadening or getting wider instead of being brought back together. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me just say, obviously I do think the scientific integrity policies are critical, and then scientists better follow them with integrity in terms of what they do. But I'm going to, unfortunately, broaden your question a little bit, because I don't think it's just an issue of, quotes, the two groups that you're talking about. I think, frankly, there's a much bigger and I think, extraordinarily dangerous development in which fundamentally too many people now just get information, which may be correct or incorrect information, but only the information they want. We don't have Walter Cronkite anymore, to be kind of an arbiter of what everybody should know, et cetera. And I think this fragmentation of information is a fundamental threat to democracy. So, having said that, I think, Bronowski once had a very nice little phrase about scientists as conspirators. They are part of a group that has a conspiracy to tell the truth. And it is extremely important that not only the scientific community, but the scientific community in particular, just continue to be a voice for that. It may feel sometimes like you're just talking into a vacuum, but there's no other way. And it's a long-term project, in my view, in which the scientific community, I think, is one of the foundational elements in terms of understanding what a fact-based and what a process for reaching facts is in society. I think that there's a lot of the politics right now around alternative facts, I guess is the popular phrase. I think it is kind of just that. I think once some of the political pressures are relieved in the system, I think I'm optimistic that we can go back to more sensible, fact-based discussions, but it's difficult.
I think at least one of our students had a question. Yeah.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. My name is Andrew Rainville. I'm a dual major in Business and Management and Electronic Media, Arts and Communication, and I will be graduating tomorrow. My question is directed toward Dr. Ferguson, although any answers would be welcome. So you've held an extensive list of positions in a variety of different industries, from financial to consulting to government to recently technology with Alphabet. So how has this breadth and depth, two areas that are focused on very much as part of the Rensselaer curriculum, altered your perspective on issues facing the world? Can you speak to the importance of them and how, as soon-to-be college graduates, can we apply that as we leave Rensselaer tomorrow?
Well, thank you for the question and congratulations. I'm impressed with your joint major. That's going to come down and get your business card. Actually, as I think about my career, ironically, I started life as a pretty optimistic person, and if anything, my career has actually made me more optimistic, which is surprising given the challenges that we so obviously confront. I have, because of my work on the Alphabet board, become even more of a technology optimist. Observing what we talked about it, but observing what they can do with artificial intelligence, marrying that to what I see in genomics and other things. I am just highly confident that folks in this room with a science type background and technology background plus others are really going to have some breakthroughs in the near future. We haven't yet seen them play out into the economy, but I'm less worried about that than I am about the creation of these breakthroughs. So that's one thing. The second thing that my career has convinced me of, though, is that there are immutable elements of human nature, greed and fear, risk and reward, all these sort of cliches, if you will. And sadly, I don't think we social scientists have had breakthroughs of the magnitude that have occurred in the physical sciences. And so we have to understand how better to use incentives, how better to use things such as behavioral economics to drive people to do what's right for themselves. So a place where I've become actually more pessimistic, sadly, over my lifetime is the ability of human beings to learn how to take care of themselves better. And the challenge that you and we in leadership roles have around incenting people to do the right thing. The reason that's very present to my mind right now is, though we haven't talked about it, outside of these halls and outside of the faculty and staff here, many Americans are confronting a very deep retirement crisis. because we in the financial services world haven't created the right set of incentives to get them to do the right thing. That's not true for TI participants, but more broadly. And so, as I think about my career, what I've discovered is the advances in physical type sciences, engineering, et cetera, are likely to really drive us to a new plateau of human endeavor, if you will. And we in the social scientists have to learn how to bring our skill levels up to what they're doing. So, it's kind of to mix my career, in some sense, looking back on it, and I feel too young to look back on my career. But here at this stage of my career, highly optimistic from what I see in technology, and I think the rest of us who deal with sociology and society in different ways have to really, come along and be much more scientific, if you will. I don't know if that's helpful. That's some of my thoughts, anyway.
Anyone else? Well, our
There's somebody, I think.
frame, is there someone?
Second student, maybe?
Please.
I don't know if it's hard to know if he's coming forward or trying to escape. Oh, he's coming forward.
My name is Ellie Ferguson. I'm hopefully graduating tomorrow with a bachelor's in physics and mathematics, as well as a master's in applied mathematics.
Wow.
And touching on something you were discussing earlier, as someone who's been so focused on the theoretical end, so focused on observing, collecting knowledge, and pushing in this really abstract network of information of how things connect, how the world works, how you can create systems of information, what advice can you give or insights would you have as such experienced and accomplished peoples of how to actually translate that knowledge into effective, useful changes in society, especially in one that is so fragmented and segmented?
Well, okay, first I will paraphrase what Roger would say, buy low, sell high.
That is true. An important lesson in life.
But more seriously, I think that no matter as you pursue, presumably for some time, certainly as I did, pursue physics or research. I don't know what your plans are, obviously. That's great. But I think it just requires being engaged as one can in society. And for different people, that will take, opportunities will arise in all kinds of different ways. For me, when I was just like 2 years into my career, I was lucky that I was given a kick in the rear by Hermann Feshbach. You won't know, but Hermann, a great physicist, who basically said that he wanted me to join a study group that would happen to be looking at something in the nuclear arena. And when I said, A, I don't know anything about it, and B, I do have this issue of getting tenure in a few years, his statement was basically, if you don't do this, you're not worth tenure. And it was great advice. So he got me engaged, in looking at problems that were outside of my research. I didn't abandon my research, obviously. I did get tenure, come to think of it. But I think it was just, looking back at it, getting involved at that stage was just a tremendous benefit for me for my entire career. So I just think it's being engaged, being an informed citizen, supporting, as is in the earlier question, supporting the idea of advancing analytical approaches to problems as an important skill set for everyone. And then opportunities will come in different ways, and you decide what forms of public service you are interested in. So I don't mean public service like going into government, that's one form. But you can serve the public in so many, many different ways, from the community level on up. So I just think it's being engaged.
Can I give maybe a surprisingly ironic answer to that? And I'm not, there's a lot of theory in economics, but obviously I'm much more in the world of application than theory. I would actually encourage anyone who this is another cliche, but whose passions are around creating fundamental knowledge, to recognize that there's probably nothing more important. And while, I don't quite know what it is to be, sort of deeply versed in theoretical physics, these folks understand that, you understand it. I would argue that is absolutely as valuable as doing, what I do, which is trying to make a buck every day for, thousands, millions of people. And so I would actually say, if where your heart and passion and skills are is down in really understanding the fundamentals that drive, the natural world as we see it, do that. And let, others who are more in the translational space, drive that. And that is not to say don't be engaged in the world. It's not to say don't be frustrated by the, foolishness of false facts and fake news and all of that. But also, I worry if our finest theoretical thinkers are feeling somehow that what they're doing is not as valuable as, the applied world. There's a book that you will not have heard of until I mention it, now you will. And it's called The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge, an ironic and funny title. It's was written by a guy named Abraham Flexner, who you will not have heard of, but he created something called the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, which I think you have heard of. That book has just been republished with a new preface by the current head of the Institute named Robert Digraph. I would encourage you and others to read it because it creates a sense of why it is that fundamental research and understanding the fundamental building blocks allows others, maybe you, but maybe others, to take that into, application. And
I normally don't weigh in when these guys are trying to answer, but I am a theoretical physicist, and I would simply say, and this builds on something that Dr. Moniz said, you have to be who you are.
Right.
And if we all are the same, we don't progress anyway. And we do go through phases and stages of our lives and our careers, and things will present themselves, and then one gets to make a decision as to whether one wants to pursue those. But in the end, you have to be who you are, and you have great gifts in the arena that you've chosen to focus in. And just go out and start
do
there.
that, absolutely.
So, thank you. I think there's one other.
Hello, excuse me. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here in the Department of Biology. I just want to first say thank you. This has been like listening to one of my favorite magazines, The Economist. So it's been a really good time. But in reading this overarching little description of the individuals and hearing what you've talked about, it's really talked about your accomplishments, everything that you seem to have done right, everything that has gone well for you. But I know that people have flaws and that people have failed. And so I'm curious if you could tell me something about one of your more important failures and what you've learned from that.
I'd be happy to start. Look, one thing, as you point out, when you're in the midst of a pretty successful career, it's easier in some sense to talk about failures. So when I was I've got so many failures. One that comes to my mind all the time is when I was an associate at McKinsey & Company, I was responsible for doing some modeling of a financial institution. And at the end of the day, the model was just wrong. No way to get around it. And it was totally my responsibility. It delayed my election to partnership by at least a year, I am sure. I am sure that my election to partnership was a lot closer than it would have been otherwise. And what I learned from that is three things. One is obviously don't screw up modeling. That's pretty straightforward. Secondly, though, one of my big values is around personal accountability. And so, it falls on my shoulders. And I think this issue of personal accountability has stayed with me for a long, long time, including around 9/11, et cetera. Frankly, the other thing I learned, though, and this is again another cliche, I'm not sure who said it, maybe Winston Churchill. I also learned that failure is never fatal or rarely fatal. Majorly, occasionally it is. And so I think we get very, very excited as human beings about, let's avoid taking risks because we might fail. If you failed enough, and I failed quite a bit in life, what you understand is it's how you show the grit and resilience to come back from it that really is the thing that's distinguishing. And the cliches about learning lessons, et cetera. So all those things are true. And so each one of my failures, and I've given one that's relatively small but really painful at the time, has been a great opportunity to say, okay, how did I screw it up? How can I not screw it up again? And how do I work really hard to regain the trust and confidence that's called for? And so I think you have to recognize that failure is an important part of life. And if you don't fail, it means you haven't taken reasonable enough risks, or you haven't taken enough risks. So you shouldn't embrace failure as I want to run to failure, but you should recognize that it's a flip side of learning, growing, developing, et cetera. And hopefully you'll learn from it. And the final point is obviously, you don't want to make too many failures because you won't be able to sit up on this podium. But you shouldn't pretend that we shouldn't pretend that we've never failed, because we fail all the time. Large things and small things. So, I look at failure as just one of the many paths that you go through to do what Ernie and Shirley are talking about in terms of learning out who you are and learning how you can contribute.
Ernie?
Well, I would just add that, first of all, I think this question of an openness to what is called failure, although I will return to that, because I'm not sure I accept that term without a further conditioning of it. But the acceptance of that actually is, in many ways, the secret sauce of the United States economy. It is central element of the entrepreneurial approach. And frankly, there are too many other economies in the world where failure is considered to be just that, and they don't do very well. Having said that, a lot of what may be called failure, I don't accept the term unless you didn't learn something from it. That's the failure, right? And so